What happens when the architects of systematic terror become the founding fathers of human rights? Picture this: a civilization so terrifying that entire nations surrendered at the mere mention of their name, yet so advanced in legal thinking that their laws protected women's rights, regulated fair commerce, and established principles of justice that still echo in modern courtrooms today. For over a millennium, from 2500 to 609 BCE, the Assyrian Empire dominated the ancient world not just through conquest, but through an unprecedented paradox. They were simultaneously history's most sophisticated torturers and its most progressive lawmakers. While their armies perfected the art of psychological warfare, flaying enemies alive and impaling entire populations as public spectacles, their scribes were quietly revolutionizing civilization itself. They were writing the world's first comprehensive legal codes that would influence every major legal system that followed, from Roman law to the US Constitution. The Assyrian Empire stretched from Egypt to Iran, encompassing dozens of cultures, languages, and peoples. Managing such diversity required more than brute force. It demanded institutional brilliance. And the Assyrians delivered both terror and justice with scientific precision. Their capital, Nineveh, housed the world's first true library system. The Library of Ashurbanipal contained over 30,000 cuneiform tablets, an ancient internet of human knowledge. Here, alongside detailed torture manuals, sat sophisticated legal treatises that established concepts modern lawyers take for granted: presumption of innocence, proportional punishment, and the right to legal representation. Consider the mind-bending reality. The same civilization that invented mass deportation as a weapon of war also created the first workplace safety regulations. The empire that terrorized the Mediterranean with crucifixions also established the first systematic protection for widows and orphans. This wasn't accidental hypocrisy, it was strategic genius. The Assyrians understood something that escaped every previous civilization. Sustainable power requires both the capacity to destroy and the wisdom to build. Terror conquers, but only justice endures. Their legal innovations were staggering. While other ancient societies relied on arbitrary royal decrees, the Assyrians created standardized legal procedures that applied regardless of social status. They developed contract law, bankruptcy protection, and even early versions of corporate responsibility, concepts that wouldn't reappear until the Renaissance. But how does a society simultaneously perfect cruelty and champion justice? The answer lies in understanding what it truly meant to be Assyrian, and why their empire lasted longer than Rome. Can terror become an exact science? The Assyrians transformed warfare from brutal chaos into a precision instrument of psychological dominance. The Assyrians didn't just wage war, they engineered it. Every aspect of their military machine was designed not merely to defeat enemies, but to break their will to resist permanently. They created the world's first military-industrial complex, where violence was systematized, documented, and refined like any other technology. Their army was humanity's first professional military force. While neighboring kingdoms relied on seasonal farmers-turned-soldiers, the Assyrians built a permanent war machine staffed by career warriors trained from childhood. Each soldier was a specialist: siege engineers who could reduce any fortress, psychological warfare experts who spread terror more effectively than any weapon, and intelligence operatives who mapped enemy weaknesses long before armies marched. Innovation was constant and methodical. They pioneered iron weaponry when enemies still used bronze, giving them crushing technological superiority. Their siege engines, mobile towers, protected battering rams, and torsion catapults could breach walls that had stood for centuries. But their most devastating weapon wasn't made of metal, it was fear itself. Mass impalement became their signature calling card, but not randomly. Every execution was a calculated performance designed for maximum psychological impact. Victims were impaled alive at city gates, where they could be seen for miles, serving as billboards of Assyrian power. The process was documented in excruciating detail, creating instruction manuals that were distributed throughout the empire as terrorist propaganda. Their deportation strategies were equally sophisticated. Rather than simply massacring conquered populations, the Assyrians perfected techniques for uprooting entire communities and relocating them thousands of miles away. This wasn't just ethnic cleansing, it was social engineering. Mixed populations were easier to control, less likely to rebel, and more dependent on imperial administration for survival. The logistics behind this terror machine were extraordinary. The Assyrians built the ancient world's most efficient communication network, a postal system that could relay messages across their empire in days rather than months. They constructed roads, supply depots, and garrison networks that could mobilize armies of 100,000 soldiers across continental distances. Their intelligence apparatus was equally advanced. Assyrian spies operated in every royal court from Egypt to Persia, gathering military intelligence, mapping fortifications, and identifying political divisions that could be exploited. Every campaign was preceded by years of psychological preparation and strategic reconnaissance. But perhaps most terrifyingly, they systematized cruelty itself. Assyrian torture wasn't random sadism, it was applied behavioral science. Different techniques were used for different purposes, some to extract information, others to intimidate witnesses, still others to serve as public examples. They created graduated scales of punishment that escalated predictably, giving potential rebels clear understanding of consequences. Their siege warfare revolutionized military engineering. They could maintain sieges for years, using advanced engineering to divert rivers, construct access ramps, and excavate tunnels that undermined enemy walls. The fall of an Assyrian siege became such a traumatic cultural memory that it shaped mythology for generations. Yet this perfect machine of war needed something beyond terror to function effectively across such vast territories. It needed a legal framework that could maintain order when the armies moved on to their next conquest. How did history's most feared empire become the unexpected birthplace of human rights law? While Assyrian armies terrorized the known world, something remarkable was happening in the royal libraries of Assur and Nineveh. The same minds that perfected systematic torture were simultaneously creating the most advanced legal framework in human history. A code of laws that wouldn't be surpassed in sophistication until the modern era. The Assyrian Law Code, compiled over centuries of imperial expansion, contained over 200 articles covering everything from property rights to criminal procedure. But this wasn't just another collection of royal decrees. It was humanity's first attempt to create law as a rational, consistent system based on principles rather than the whims of rulers. Their approach to women's rights was revolutionary. In an era when women were typically considered property, Assyrian law granted them extraordinary legal autonomy. Women could own businesses, initiate divorce proceedings, inherit property, and represent themselves in court. The code specifically protected widows and single mothers, requiring the state to provide financial support if family networks failed. Marriage and family law showed sophisticated legal thinking centuries ahead of its time. The code recognized different types of marriage contracts, regulated inheritance rights for legitimate and illegitimate children, and established divorce procedures that protected both parties. It even addressed domestic violence, imposing penalties on husbands who abused their wives, a concept that wouldn't reappear in Western law until the 20th century. Their commercial regulations were equally groundbreaking. The Assyrians developed legal concepts that modern lawyers recognize immediately: secured transactions, limited liability partnerships, bankruptcy protection, and regulated interest rates. They created the world's first systematic banking regulations, protecting both lenders and borrowers from exploitation. The concept of evidence and testimony was extraordinarily advanced. Assyrian courts distinguished between direct and circumstantial evidence, regulated witness testimony, and established procedures for cross-examination. They even recognized that confessions obtained under torture might be unreliable, a legal insight that wouldn't be widely accepted until the Enlightenment. Perhaps most remarkably, they pioneered proportional punishment. While earlier codes like Hammurabi's relied on literal retribution, eye for an eye, Assyrian law introduced the revolutionary concept that punishment should fit the crime and consider the defendant's circumstances. They developed sliding scales of penalties that took into account social status, intent, and mitigating factors. Their slavery laws were paradoxically humanitarian. While slavery remained legal, the code established minimum standards for treatment, regulated working conditions, and protected slaves from excessive abuse. It even guaranteed slaves' rights to personal property and family relationships, protections that didn't exist in many societies until modern times. The judicial system itself was institutionally sophisticated. They established courts of different jurisdictions, appeal procedures, and separation between judicial and administrative functions. Judges were appointed based on legal expertise rather than birth or political favor, and their decisions were subject to regular review. Contract law reached unprecedented complexity. Assyrian merchants operated across continents, and their legal system had to accommodate international commerce. They developed standardized contract forms, dispute resolution mechanisms, and enforcement procedures that functioned across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The same empire that perfected impalement had created legal protections for the weakest members of society. This wasn't contradiction, it was the secret to their thousand-year dominance. Mind blown by these ancient legal innovations. Share this video to spread awareness of how Assyrian law influenced everything from Roman jurisprudence to modern constitutions. Why did the most brutal empire in history last longer than Rome? Because they understood that true power requires both the sword and the scale of justice. The genius of Assyrian civilization wasn't in their cruelty or their legal system alone. It was in recognizing these as complementary tools of imperial control. They had discovered something that eluded every previous empire. Terror could conquer territories, but only justice could transform conquered peoples into loyal citizens. This strategic duality explains the Assyrian Empire's extraordinary longevity. While other ancient empires collapsed within generations, the Assyrians maintained dominance for over a millennium. Their system didn't depend on charismatic leaders or military luck. It was built on institutions that functioned regardless of who ran them. When Assyrian armies conquered new territories, they didn't just impose military occupation. They offered something most populations had never experienced: predictable, consistent justice. Local peoples discovered that under Assyrian rule, their property rights were protected, their commercial contracts were enforced, and their legal disputes could be resolved through clear procedures rather than arbitrary power. For populations accustomed to the capricious rule of local strongmen, Assyrian administration often represented a significant improvement in quality of life. Yes, rebellion meant horrific punishment, but compliance brought unprecedented legal protection and economic opportunity. The Library of Ashurbanipal represents the culmination of this systematic approach to knowledge and power. With its 30,000-plus tablets, it was humanity's first attempt at universal knowledge preservation. But it wasn't just a library. It was an empire-wide intelligence system that collected, analyzed, and distributed information on everything from military tactics to medical procedures. The Assyrians understood that knowledge was power, and preserving knowledge preserved power. Their scribes copied and translated texts from every civilization they encountered, creating a cultural synthesis that influenced all subsequent empires. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, when Rome absorbed the Mediterranean, when Islamic scholars preserved classical knowledge, they were all building on foundations the Assyrians had laid. This institutional approach to empire building proved incredibly resilient. Even when the Assyrian Empire finally fell in 609 BCE, its legal and administrative systems didn't disappear. The Babylonians adopted Assyrian law codes, the Persians inherited their administrative structure, and eventually these innovations reached Greece and Rome. Legal concepts the Assyrians pioneered: proportional punishment, evidence-based trials, women's property rights, commercial regulation, became fundamental principles of Western law. The Roman legal system, which forms the basis of most modern legal codes, incorporated hundreds of Assyrian innovations. Their military innovations were equally enduring. Professional armies, systematic siege warfare, psychological operations, continental logistics, all became standard elements of warfare that persist today. Modern military academies still study Assyrian campaigns as examples of strategic thinking and operational excellence. Even their apparent contradiction between brutality and justice found echoes in later empires. Rome combined Assyrian-style terror tactics with sophisticated legal systems. Medieval kingdoms balanced brutal enforcement with elaborate law codes. Even modern states use refined versions of strategies the Assyrians developed 3 millennia ago. The Assyrian legacy reveals an uncomfortable truth about power and civilization. The most successful societies often combine elements we consider contradictory. They were ruthless, but also visionary. They were conquerors, but also lawmakers. They were masters of terror, but also architects of justice. In every modern courthouse, in every constitution that protects individual rights, in every legal system that balances punishment with protection, something of the Assyrian genius survives. Their true monument isn't the ruins of Nineveh. It's the institutions they created that continue functioning 3,000 years after their empire's fall. The next time you see justice depicted as a blindfolded figure holding scales and a sword, remember, the Assyrians understood that lasting power requires both the capacity to destroy and the wisdom to build. They didn't just conquer the ancient world, they taught it how to govern itself. And in doing so, they created the template for every successful empire that followed right up to the present day. Amazed by how ancient innovations still shape our world? Subscribe for more deep dives into civilizations that changed everything. Drop a comment about which aspect of Assyrian legacy surprised you most, and share this video to spread awareness of how history's most feared empire became the foundation of modern law.